In the context of the homily series that I have been giving on different cultural issues, today's second reading gives us a beautiful and fuller picture of what love is. A concept that our world is often quite confused about. And in his letter to the Ephesians, St. Paul gives us really the most profound vision of what marriage and love is that we find in the Scriptures, although we might not recognize it at first. So at the beginning of that passage, we hear Paul say, wives should be subordinate to their husbands. Now, before all the men here start to make lists about all the things you want your wives to do for you, we need to understand what Paul's actually saying. Because many people misunderstand this reading, because at first it looks like women should just be utterly submissive to everything that men say they should do. But that is not at all what Paul is saying. So what does he mean? Well, we need to look a little bit more closely at this word, to be subordinate or be submissive. If you break it into its parts, submissive, submission. Sub means under or below something. And a mission is, of course, a goal, a purpose that we're trying to do. And so what he's saying here is that wives are to be under the husband's mission. And so the question then is what is the husband's mission? Because men, we don't get to make it up. Paul tells us a little bit further on. He says, husbands, love your wives, even as Christ loved the church. So men, our mission is to love as Christ loves the church. And how did he love her? Well, Jesus sacrificed his whole life for her. He handed himself over on the cross, even to die, so that she would have life. And so when Paul says, wives, be subordinate to your husbands, what he's saying is, wives, allow your husbands to love you to the point of death. Not necessarily physical death, because you may not want them to die, but something maybe even more difficult. Allow your husbands to love you enough to die to their own self-centeredness, to give their entire lives to you, so that you both may become holy. Because it's not just the husband who has to die to his selfishness, but both men and women, to give your whole selves to each other out of love. And so in this passage we see what love really is all about. The love isn't just about good feelings, but love is about the free choice to seek the good of another person above seeking it for ourselves. After the model of Jesus himself, who freely chose to offer his life upon the cross for our good, for our salvation. And that's why St. Pope John Paul II, he reflected that the opposite of love isn't so much hate as it is use. Using somebody for what you can get for yourself, rather than desiring their good before your own. And so all the issues that I've been talking about over the course of many weeks now really are examples of ways in which people use one another, using other people to one's own ends, rather than truly expressing a self-giving love that's modeled after Christ's love. And it makes me think of a quote from now venerable Dr. Jerome Lejeune. He said that contraception is to make love without a child, artificial fertilization is to make a child without love, abortion is to unmake the child, and pornography is to unmake love. And all but that last one we've already talked about, so we need to consider the final one today. Because pornography may be one of the most widespread ways in which people are formed incorrectly, deformed really, to see others and use others rather than express real love. Through it, they learn to treat people like objects. And here I mean both the viewing of explicit materials and the actions that often go with it. Though there's many people in our world today that believe that pornography is perfectly acceptable. They may say, but it's a private thing, doesn't hurt anybody else. But just because a sin is hidden doesn't make it any less a sin. Somewhere around 4 million U.S. adults regularly visit pornographic sites. And stats from just one site, since 2015, human beings have spent way over 1 million years viewing those imagery. And it's not just a temptation for men, but it also affects women as well. To such a state that 16 states today have officially recognized pornography as a public health crisis due to the real risks that are involved in its viewing. So the first thing about pornography is that it affects relationships. We all desire love. We all want to know and be known. We all want to feel connected. But we can pursue that in ways that it doesn't really work. Even pursuing it when it's nothing more than pornographic images on a screen. And when the images end, there's no actual real person there to talk to. There's no one to share with, no one to give and take. Being the way it is with being with an actual person. And so studies show that those that use pornography express less love for others, become more critical of appearances, more disrespectful and aggressive, even less willing to stick around in a relationship. And the chances of infidelity with it increase by 300%, as well as over half of divorces cite this issue as a significant factor in the falling apart of the relationship. Pornography is connected to an increase of negative attitudes, especially towards women, decreased empathy of victims of sexual violence, increase in dominating and imposing behavior, and it even adds to the serious problem of sex trafficking. To put it very briefly, pornography is basically a scientifically proven guide on how to love poorly. It trains the mind to see the other person as objects. It unmakes love, turning it into use. So, second, pornography also becomes very addictive. It triggers a release of chemicals within the brain. Dopamine, serotonin, epinephrine, oxytocin. All these chemicals are natural to the body and it's needed in various points. But with pornography, the brain becomes overloaded with these chemicals. And it creates a kind of high within. The brain then gets dependent, used, rewired to needing all this extra release of the chemicals. And needing more and more to get the same kind of rush. And so dependency will develop along the same processes as that also happens with hard drugs. And that's led even secular organizations to call pornography the new drug, because it makes it very difficult to escape when somebody wants to be free of it. On top of that, too, is a kind of cycle of shame. When one engages in the addictive behavior, when they finally come down off of that high, they really hit a low because it's failed to satisfy what their hearts are really longing for. And so feeling the kind of guilt and remorse from having done that, they tell themselves, I'm not going to do that again. And they vow to change their behavior. But then another stressor, other difficulties arise, and trying to find comfort, they look back to that habit that's been formed and that chemical effect upon the brain that's been created. It leads them back into the behavior. And once again, afterwards, they feel the low and they feel the shame. And over and around, they're caught within this cycle. And even after coming to know that it's not good for them, it can be very difficult to escape. And that's true of any kind of addictive sin. It becomes enslaving. And it's important, especially for parents, to know that this kind of cycle can tragically be entered in upon when someone's really young. The largest consumers of internet pornography are from ages 12 to 17. And its prevalence in our world today means that children are first exposed even younger than that. What begins unintentionally for them, the confusion of feeling both the curiosity and the guilt of knowing that it's not good, can lead them right into that kind of cycle of shame. Unless something's done to try to break it. And so steps to help protect, especially our children, from that kind of exposure is so important. But also to be able to, parents to be able to teach your children, what do I do if I come across it? The first thing, of course, is to turn it off, turn away. Recognize what it is. That's a bad picture. That's pornography. And then finally, to know that they can talk to mom or dad. Not so that you can scold them for having seen that. No, that's not the purpose. But rather you want to help them to become free of getting caught in that cycle of shame that can hold them. So they might say, Mom, I saw that bad picture on the computer. And say, well, thanks for telling me. As we've talked about before, we know that when people are shown with little or no clothing, it's not respecting them the way that God's created them. At first, it might feel exciting, but it's kind of a trick that can damage the way that we think and the way that we love. It's kind of like food that's been poisoned. It might taste good at first, but it can harm us. For parents, I especially recommend a book called Good Pictures, Bad Pictures. Good Pictures, Bad Pictures. It's written specifically for parents to help you learn, how do I talk to my children about this? St. Maximilian Kolbe, we celebrated his feast day just over a week ago. He said that whenever you feel guilty, even if it's because you've consciously committed a sin, a serious sin, something you've kept doing many, many times, never let the devil deceive you by allowing him to discourage you. May every fall, even if it's a serious and habitual sin, always become for us a small step toward a higher degree of perfection. The only reason why God permits us to fall is to cure us from our own self-conceit, from our pride, to make us humble and thus make us docile to the divine graces. What Kolbe is saying there is that pride is a more deadly sin than lust is, when we look at the 7 deadly sins. That the pride of claiming that something is not a sin is worse than that sin itself. We can learn too from our first reading where Joshua puts forth the choice to the Israelites, saying, decide today who you will serve. And that's what we have to do every single day when we make choices. False gods or the God of the universe, to use someone or to express love. The habits of habitual sexual sin, or the hard work of receiving freedom from that, from God. The pride of never admitting our sins, or the humility of going to the sacrament of reconciliation. Because you should never be embarrassed to bring this to confession. You can simply say something like, I looked at impure images and committed impure actions with myself. But the enemy will try to either harden one's heart so that it's never brought to the Lord, or to convince somebody that I am just so messed up I couldn't possibly be loved. There's nothing that I can do. Because the truth is that you're not alone in that struggle. Do not let shame keep you from receiving God's forgiveness. When it comes to habitual sins in any of our lives, we might get tired of confessing them. But God never gets tired of forgiving you. Pornography may rewire the brain and the heart towards selfishness, but that at the same time means that God can get in and rewire it back to authentic love. As St. Maximilian said, may every fall become a small step towards greater holiness. There's so much potential for human love and good that's been wasted upon selfish human acts like pornography. But just think of the good that could change the whole world when we have many individual acts of self-giving love. Don't give your heart to something without a pulse. The deepest needs of our fragile human hearts can only be met in the fragile heart of another human being. It can only be found in the love that's modeled after Christ's love for you.